Welcome into the Backroads Bill podcast. I'm Ben, and this week we had the pleasure of talking to Adam Shoalts, who is a professional explorer and author and has many other credentials. The list, it's a very long list. We talked to Adam about what got him to become an avid explorer and outdoorsman and what inspired some of his best-selling books. He also talks about surviving on some of these trips while he was alone, including one instance where he was in a canoe and he was up against a waterfall. Well, we're pleased to be joined today over the power of the internet with Adam Shoalts. Adam is a national best-selling author 4 times over, has been declared by Canadian Geographic as one of the greatest living explorers of our time, and named Canada's Indiana Jones by the Toronto Star. Adam, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me on, Ben.
How does it feel? I got to ask, I'm a big Indiana Jones fan. How does it feel getting that title? That's got to be pretty cool.
It was a little bit ironic. That was way back in 2013. It was the Toronto Star. They actually had me on the top of the front page, calling me Canada's Indiana Jones. But at the time, I was 27 at the time. I'd never actually seen Indiana Jones.
What?
Yeah.
No.
Well, I wasn't well up on American pop culture, but I rented the movies and I watched them at that time. And I was like, well, I don't really see any similarity. He's got like a bullwhip and a pistol, and he's always beating up Nazis. And I've never beat up any Nazis, and I don't have a pistol or a bullwhip. However, I was flattered, and I do have an academic background in archaeology and history, and I've worked on archaeology digs. So I took it as a compliment, suffice to say.
Bill, why don't you tell us a little bit about Adam and why he was a name that you wanted to reach out and get on the podcast?
Yeah, well, Adam, Backroads Bill is his backyard is Northern Ontario, and we'll also talk about the fifth book, Where the Falcon Flies, in a bit. But this first book, Alone Against the North, remains my favorite. I like them all because I am a geographer and have some things in common with Adam. I'm an adventurer as well, but again, not to the same extent. So way back when I discovered Adam through Penguin Random House and a publicist. So we invited Adam way back when. I think at that time there was only this one book, if my memory serves me right. And so we had him come to the Earth Day Book Talk and speak about Alone Against the North. And since then he's been back again, and books have come to their fruition. And so Adam, as you said, he is known for his adventuring and his certainly in Canada, and so people that know Survivor Man, and Survivor Man has been to the Ecology Center a long time ago, before Les Stroud became Survivor Man, and did some training actually at the Canadian Ecology Center. So Adam is, all of a sudden you see someone that's really bringing Canada, I think, to the forefront with regards to wilderness and this adventure. So I was immediately drawn to him. So it was easy to make that. It was very magnetic, I guess I would say. So, and so that was, I think that's the first thing. And then, of course, to have him up at the Canadian Ecology Center and the books, and then follow him over the last few years. And his life has changed. He'll talk a bit about that as well, and fitting all the familiar things in and still doing what he loves to do. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, what he's going to do next.
Adam, why don't you tell us a little bit about what got you into being an explorer?
Well, I mean, I think it's partly just a consequence of growing up in Canada. I mean, I think a lot of kids all over Canada, whether they live in Ontario or BC or Newfoundland or indeed anywhere in between, we naturally gravitate towards the outdoors because we're lucky enough to live in a country where we still have so many wild places and easy access to them, where in so much of the rest of the world, that's not necessarily the case. So as a kid, I was blessed that I had a forest right on my doorstep. Literally, that was my backyard. It was my front yard as well. So with my brother and my dog, every chance I got, I was always playing in the woods from like the age of 4 on. I remember like camping out in what we would call forts, where we didn't even have a tent. We would make little stick shelters, like elaborate lean-tos, and we would sleep out at them, ask mom and dad, can we camp out when we're 5 or 6, and doing that kind of thing. And when I got a little bit older, I became more interested in learning archery. And we used to always walk around with bows and arrows, shooting stumps in the woods. And then I wanted to learn about the different trees and plants. That's Jack in the pulpit root. Don't eat that one. Burns like liquid fire. Where are the wild blueberries and the wild raspberries? So we had these grand adventures as kids in the woods around my house. And my father, he was a woodworker, and he had a wood shop just outside our house, and he would build everything from grandfather clocks to kitchen tables using all hand tools and harvesting wood from the forest around the house. And when I was a little bit older, like in the 8th grade, he started building canoes for us to take on weekend paddling trips. So we would build cedar strip canoes, and later we built birch bark canoes. So that's kind of what started my love of bushcraft and the great outdoors and paddling. And I suppose it was supplemented along the way by the education system. I remember in the 8th grade, Mr. Bianchini, my 8th grade teacher, bless his heart, he had our class read Farley Mowat, Lost in the Barrens. That was the book we read in our class together. And reading that as a 13-year-old boy, it certainly fired my imagination to want to have adventures on a bigger scale in the Canadian wilderness. So it was just a combination of all those things. Growing up in Canada with a forest on my doorstep and reading books like Farley Mowat, that inspired me to want to, pursue this as a I was going to say as a career, but that in some ways sounds like it's, a little too formulaic. I think it's more of a way of life, as anyone who loves the outdoors, I think, can identify with that. So that's kind of what led me down this path in life, you might say.
Well, we can thank then Farley Mowat in part for Beyond the Trees, and because you kind of retraced some of those steps, but certainly on your own. And Ben, you were going to ask a question there.
Oh, I was just going to ask, what got you into deciding you wanted to be an author and wanted to start writing books?
That was probably a little bit later on, maybe in my upper years of high school, when I was getting more into literature and really starting to read. I remember I read a lot when I was around 18, 19. That's when I really discovered a deep love of reading. And I would just go into the library and pull every book off the shelf. I went, beyond Farley Mowat to Pierre Burton and Peter C. Newman, and then beyond Canada. And I used to read all the old classics. I'd pull off, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes and Washington Irving. And, I'd read everything I could lay my hands on. And I think around that age, I wanted to write books. Although I think in the beginning, I was thinking I would mostly write history books because in university, I decided I wanted to study history and archaeology and historical geography. So I wasn't actually intending to write adventure books. That happened inadvertently. We already alluded to the Toronto Star and the Indiana Jones stuff in 2013. And there was actually a literary agent who emailed me and said, "Hey, I've read some of your articles. Would you ever want to write an adventure book?" And I said, "Well, that doesn't sound like such a bad idea." So one thing led to another. And then before I knew it, I'd written the book, Alone Against the North, that Bill had held up there, was my first book.
And again, when I look back and think about, and I'm looking at a younger Adam on the front, but the Alone Against the North and an expedition into the unknown. People have to understand that all your books and all your adventures is a huge amount of planning and looking at maps and Google Earth and aerial photography and historic journals and the like. But the question about Alone Against the North, and again, I've done a couple stories with Adam, and I've done one, again, for the first time he came to the Canadian Ecology Centre at the Earth Day Book Talk, is that this one was kind of interesting because no one had actually been there. So when you look at what you've done to date so far and into the future, this is something the Again River was something that it's like a challenge. Like, first of all, to find a place where no one had ever been before, and then actually, again, you'll talk about how you went with someone, then you were alone to actually accomplish this. So tell us a little bit about that motivation and Alone Against the North.
Yeah, so when I was a kid, I mostly just focused on wandering in the woods on foot. And I didn't really get into canoeing until I was, 14, 15. And then we started doing weekend canoeing trips with my dad and my brother. And at that age, I was reading a lot of Kevin Callan Canoe Routes books. I had his entire collection, like Canoe Routes of Northern Ontario or Paddler's Guide to Algonquin. And as you well know, there's a very robust paddlers community in Ontario and in Canada. And this community, very passionate about paddling, and they exchange all sorts of information on routes and campsites, like, camp on the south side of that island, beautiful views, great fishing, and there's a whole ton of resources devoted to canoe camping. And there are many fabulous canoe camping routes all over Ontario and elsewhere. So I really got into that when I was still in high school as a teenager. And I accumulated many books on canoe camping. There were older ones from like the 1970s published by the Ministry of Natural Resources, newer ones by Kevin Callan. There were even online websites and forums and magazines devoted to the whole pursuit of canoe camping. And then when I was about 21, 22, I had a sort of epiphany, just doing tons of canoe camping, isn't that kind of funny how everyone in the community, we all love the outdoors and the call of the loon and, a beautiful sunset over a northern lake. But isn't it funny how we just do like all of these established routes, where it's like I remember when my father and my brother and I would choose a canoe route for the weekend, we would do the research. Like we'd pick up our Kevin Callan books or what other resources we had, and we would read up on it, and then we'd compare and say, oh, it's a choice between these 3 routes. They all sound pretty good, but this one's got a little bit longer portage, or maybe the fishing sounds better there, or maybe we only have time to do this in these 4 days. And then when I had that epiphany, it was like, why do we always choose like established canoe routes from books? What if we did one that's not in any book? It's not on any paddler's website or online forum. It's not in any old Ministry of Natural Resource report. But what if we did 180 degrees, the opposite of what we normally do, and we deliberately choose a place that we can't find any information on? It sounded sort of counterintuitive at that time, but it just occurred to me, wouldn't that be kind of fun in itself? And for a lot of people, maybe that sounds instinctively appealing. But I think for a lot of canoeists, it sounds the opposite of appealing. Like, they want those guidebooks that tell them about the rapids and stay on the left side of the river there and look for the fallen tree for the start of the portage. But I said, well, let's try to go somewhere where there is no published information that we can lay our hands on. And, as vast as Canada is with thousands of rivers, it turned out this was actually a surprisingly difficult thing to find. I pulled up my maps of northern Ontario and northern Quebec, and I could see hundreds of rivers on them. And I just started going through them systematically. And some of them are very famous. As soon as you Google them, you would find dozens of websites and dozens of books and even YouTube documentaries and videos about them. And I would cross those off the list. And as you got to the more obscure ones that are more isolated, more difficult to access, maybe there's no road access, maybe you can only get in there on a float plane or something, the amount of available records would shrink. But you could still find some if you dug hard enough. Maybe you'd have to go onto a university library and search through their more extensive databases, and you start finding geological survey reports or old records like that. And I kept doing that, and I kept narrowing my list down until I finally settled upon a river known as the Again River that I could find virtually no published information on whatsoever, other than the official Geographic Names Board approving the name in French and English. Virtually nothing. And I could see it on a map, just this squiggly blue line. And by this point, I'd really crossed off all the big waterways. We're talking, this is a pretty small river. In places, not really much more than a creek, only about 100 kilometers long, no road access, pretty remote. But this one, because I couldn't find anything on Google or Wikipedia or in any published book, it appealed to me. I was like, okay, now this is exciting. Here I am heading off into the unknown. It's going to be a different type of canoe experience. It's going to be more of an adventure. And I was very young at that time. I was only 22. This is back in 2008. But that's how I stumbled upon this different idea for a canoe adventure. And that's what started it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I get thrilled. It's always a thrill to look at access, to try to find a place or try to find a better way to access a place. So that whole concept, again, the earlier question was, how did I get drawn to this book? And Adam, I think was that thinking that it really excited me. Thought, wow, yeah, this is something that's kind of never been done before. Because you look at the world and you think there's no place that can be like that. But Adam found one and put it all together. And of course the book itself. I mean, I've been in that area because just to the west of that is that Bill Barocco. And I've done a couple stories and still have not made it to the site where people fly in, helicopter in, but we've tried to get in a couple or 3 times, certainly in the wintertime, and still have not achieved that. But that is nasty, some really nasty ground. And in the book, there are these instances where the maps, we will say the maps they don't lie, but there are things that you come across, and next thing you know, you could be going over a waterfall. Maybe you should tell that story.
Yeah, well, I mean, at that time, I mean, some of the topographic maps were still quite limited. And one of the biggest differences, I mean, it's not that long ago in the grand scheme of things, but a lot has changed in the last 16 years. I mean, the technology has improved by leaps and bounds, and it's proliferated, so it's available everywhere. But in 2008, there were still very limited satellite images available. It wasn't like today, where you could pretty easily pull up high-resolution images of most of northern Canada. At that time, the only satellite images available were very blurry, low resolution. You could barely make heads or tails out of them. And the only topographic maps in existence were based on what geographers call remote sensing, which is making maps off of aerial photographs, most of the aerial photographs being taken in the 1950s by the Geological Survey, black and white images where, again, a lot of the definition or the detail is quite limited. So things like waterfalls could easily be missed and left off the map entirely. So it all sounded, rather old-fashioned. This attempt to go to a river that was only imperfectly mapped and which I couldn't obtain any published information on. And I had wanted to go there in 2008, and I had done a canoe trip with my father actually to go there, but we didn't end up getting to the river because it was a difficult place to access. There's no roads anywhere near it. The only way to get there would involve quite a lot of bushwhacking, upstream travel, going up some beaver creeks and lifting over dams and trying to hack your way across muskeg and dense boreal forest. So we didn't get there. And then I thought, okay, well, next summer, 2009, I'll go back. And I took one of my best friends, Wes, who we've been friends with since the second grade. He and I are just about to go on another adventure in a couple of months, but he came with me. But our hands were tied because his older sister was getting married that summer, and his family had made it crystal clear that he could not miss his sister's wedding. So we were making good progress, but we didn't know what to expect because, again, there was no satellite images or published information we could pull up to guide us. So we didn't really know, how long is it going to take us to get up some of these rivers upstream? They're going to be really big rapids that will slow us down. Is the forest going to be really soggy and we're going to be sinking down into our knees in muskeg? So we were making good progress, and we were almost at the headwaters of the river where we had to sit down and make we had a dilemma to resolve, which is, okay, we're making good progress. It's so close. It's tantalizing. I can almost reach out and touch it, but I don't know how long it's going to take us to get down this river. Could there be waterfalls? Could there be rapids? I can't guarantee it. So I said to him, look, Wes, I'm certain we'll get there, but I can't guarantee that by the time we get to James Bay and Saltwater and Moosonee and all these things that we'll get back in time for your sister's wedding. So he said, look, we got to turn around. So we turned around, and I was like, so close. Third time's a charm. And I figured I'd go back in 2010, but I wasn't able to because Wes wasn't available. And because we'd gotten so close, I thought, there's no way I couldn't do it without my friend Wes. If he's not available in 2010, I'm just going to have to kick the can down the road. And as much as I'm burning to go back, I can't go back without him. So that summer, I ended up doing different adventures, expeditions. I was working on my master's degree. And then in 2011, I was planning on going back, but the world is such a big, fascinating place. I ended up going down a different rabbit hole, and I got involved with the Royal Canadian Geological Society at that time, and I did an expedition for the Royal Canadian Geological Society to a totally different area up near Hudson's Bay, which I wrote about in my book, Expedition Up There with Polar Bears. And I didn't go back to the Again River until 2012. Finally, 2012 rolled around, and I said, look, I have to cross this off my list. It's been at the back of my mind. It has never left it since I first learned about it. And I said, this summer, no matter what, come hell or high water, do or die, I'm going to that river no matter what it takes. And Wes really wanted to go, but he had started a brand new job. We were young, right? We were in our mid-20s, and he had just started working for the railroad. He couldn't get any time off. And I said, man, well, I cannot delay anymore. And at that time, I'd only done a limited amount of solo expeditions. So I just sort of crossed my own Rubicon and said, that's it. I'm going solo. I know the dangers, the risks, the hardships will be magnified as a result, but there is no other alternative at this point. So I went solo in 2012 to the Again River. But I was so busy. I'd started my doctorate now, so I was working on my PhD. I was in Ohio, of all places. I was in Ohio on an archaeological dig, working on a pre-contact Iroquois site in a little cornfield in Ohio, when I just made up my mind to pack up my stuff and go for the Again River. So I'd been running around like a mile a minute, juggling so many different projects that I hadn't actually done any real trip planning for the Again River for 4 years. Not since, 3 years, not since 2009. And I just grabbed my old water-stained printout maps from like Toporama and my road map, and I drove up there and said, I'm going no matter what it takes. And I bushwhacked and hiked and portaged my way all the way to the headwaters. And the headwaters were really small. I mean, you'd think it was like a ditch, right? Like we're talking a little tiny stream, not even enough water to float a boat. But I found my way into this muskeg. And from the start, from the headwaters, I went down it. And in the beginning, it was very small, right? You were paddling just a tiny little creek that in places was ankle deep. If I got to knee deep water, I was like, wow, now we're in deep water here. My paddle, I can almost actually swing a paddle now. I'm just shoving along. And it wasn't until several days down the river that it got a little bit bigger, but still, you're talking a very small waterway, not like the Mattawa River. This is like a big creek. And there were some rapids and things, so it was getting a little deeper. And I came around a bend, and the bend was deceptive because when I came around the bend, there was some rapids, and there was a ledge with a drop. And this drop was a couple of feet. So I thought, no big deal. But what I didn't realize, because of course the satellite images are inadequate, the maps doesn't have any of this level of detail on it, is that below that ledge, there was a second drop. So a little pool and then a second drop with a significant waterfall, about a 20-foot waterfall. And I went right over that waterfall in my canoe. But that was all part of the adventure of the whole thing. I mean, luckily I lived to tell the story because I'm here today on the podcast. But yeah, that's...
Well, one of the things I was going to ask is because, and Bill, obviously you're a huge canoeer, but what's that like going alone? You're basically going, well, I guess that's the point of the book, but you are going alone in a very kind of dangerous area. So what kind of goes through your mind? Do you think about this could turn out very, very badly, or are you just so experienced that, I don't know, I feel like this is kind of a safety thing, right? I guess I'm just asking more about the safety precautions that would go into that.
Well, Adam can speak more about being alone than I can. But when I'm alone out there, first of all, people tell, you shouldn't be alone. And of course, sometimes that creeps into your mind when you get into certain situations. But I think because we mitigate the risk all the time when we're out there by ourselves, that we're always thinking about what we're doing. And it doesn't matter whether it's at your campsite or in the water, you're very, very careful. And the thing I always find, of course, is fatigue clouds your mind sometimes. And you think, I can do this, but you always kind of check yourself. But Adam could speak onto that. But before he does, though, I was just thinking that canoe, Adam, I'm going down to the opening of the new Canadian Canoe Museum. Hopefully someday that canoe will be in there, because by that time you'll have probably 14 books, not 5. And that canoe will be the time when Adam could have met his demise on book 1, and never mind the other 13 to follow.
Well, I think I actually sold that canoe for about $300.
We need to find it. We need to find it.
I could track down the person on Facebook who bought it, but that was, I was cash strapped because I was just basically doing all these adventures, and I sold it for about $300 on Kijiji. And it was pretty busted up from going over a waterfall. I repaired it, but I was putting it through a lot. It wasn't a very good canoe to begin with. I bought it like used on Kijiji, and then I resold it afterwards just to make a couple $100. So maybe that person, if she's out there, she could resell it now for more money. I don't know. But yeah, I was doing all those kinds of things. I was using a lot of homemade gear, stuff I would get from garage sales or make myself. On those early expeditions all the time. But I think as far as the risk goes, when you're traveling alone, I agree 100%, Bill. You have to be sort of ultra conscious of all of the potential hazards and dangers around you. And if you're paying attention to those things and you're constantly sort of mindful of them, then the risk is minimal, so long as you're aware of those risks, because you're on your own. And if something goes wrong, realistically, no one is actually going to be able to get to your location in time to rescue you. I remember Bill Mason, another author I read a lot when I was a teenager. In one of his books, Bill Mason, he talks about the appeal of solo travel in the wilderness, something he did on occasion. And he actually has a passage in his book, I think it's The Path of the Paddle, where he says, look, if you're going to go solo in the wilderness, it's not everyone's cup of tea. There are definitely rewards and enjoyments that come with it, but you have to take a moment, he said, Bill Mason, he said, you have to take a moment to really visualize anything that could go wrong. And I actually quote this on Alone Against the North because it made such a big impact on me. I used to take his books with me on my canoe trips, put them in my backpack. They'd be all water stained from going through rapids. But he said, look, imagine you're chopping firewood and, the axe bounces off the log and hits you in the leg. That's something you have to be aware of ahead of time because you can't afford to make that mistake when you're alone in the wilderness. You'll bleed to death. Imagine you're going upriver in some rapids, or you're lining your canoe with a rope down through rapids and you slip and smash your head off a rock. Doesn't matter if you have a life jacket on. If you fall and you smash your head off a rock and you're lying face down in a river, it's game over. And Bill Mason went through, half a dozen scenarios like that where something could go wrong. And it's not, his intention wasn't, I don't think, to scare readers and make them think solo travel's bad. Quite the opposite. He was preaching the joys of solo travel in the wilderness, but he was saying you have to be smart, you have to be responsible, and you have to think of all these hazards so that you can minimize them and make sure that they don't happen to you. And those words, they've stayed with me ever since. And I always remind myself of those things. Where is the blade facing when I'm cutting something? I don't want to slip and cut myself. Where am I camping tonight? In far north, like if you're in the Northwest Territories, the Mackenzie River, let's say, there are lots of landslides, and these landslides can be massive. They can cover hundreds of meters. If you had a cabin or a cottage there, it would, completely destroy it. And in the spring, especially, you can see evidence of all these landslides. So that kind of stuff, right? Oh, this would be a great campsite. I'm exhausted. But no, it's not worth the risk. I don't like the way that bank looks behind it. It's really high. It looks a little bit loose. I'm going to have to push on farther, and I might have to end up camping in a thorn bush just to be safe because I don't want to have a landslide hit me in the night. So that kind of stuff is never far from my mind when I'm alone. And it might sound strange for someone who hasn't done it, but eventually it just becomes second nature. And just as Bill Mason said, you do learn to love the whole experience of it all. And I don't think it necessarily is something that has to be stressful or scary. If you just have your simple rules you follow, all of a sudden you can learn to relax. And paradoxically, traveling alone in the wilderness can be some of the most relaxing experiences. I always say getting away from emails and 24/7 news cycles and all that stuff, all the distractions of the modern world, going back into the wilderness, doing what I do. I say I'm very lucky to have such a relaxing, stress-free job as I do.
Yeah. Now that reminds me a couple of things. One, it reminds me, and people should experience this alone business, but people that have gone to canoe camps, children's camps, and they get, as they work their way up, and upon graduation or before they leave the camp, they might have that night out alone on the island and those kinds of things. And when I talk to my students that have done that, they most often bring that time when they were able to go out alone under certain conditions and do that. But the second one was a couple of weeks ago on the Backroads Bill podcast, we had a contemporary, James Raffin, who's written a book on Bill Mason and Fire in the Bones, and we got to talking about Bill, and Bill Mason was a very spiritual person. Very, he could quote from the Bible, and that was just about this alone business too, about your spirituality. Not that tell us about what you think about with regards to. For me, nature is my synagogue, my church, my temple is outside, and I say that all the time, and many people do as well. So maybe just a couple comments about your spirituality when you're alone and outside in nature, because again, from a child, when we trace our roots back, we do go back to that sense of play and how it all evolved and just being outside all the time. But then I think it overcomes our thinking with regards to our own personal relationships with other people, but with nature as well.
Yeah, I don't get asked that question very often. But yeah, I'm the same. I mean, the forest is my temple. It's my church. And I mean, it's strange, but when you travel in a truly remote place, I mean, you're in the true wilderness where there's no roads, no designated campgrounds, no trails to follow. It's hard for it not to affect you on some sort of deeper level, some sort of spiritual sense. I mean, you're impressed, even if you're not at all a romantic sort of person, just traveling across this landscape where there's nothing but Arctic tundra for as far as the eye can see, or endless old growth forest, black spruce and tamarack, centuries old, stretching to the horizon. It's hard for that not to affect you. I mean, it speaks to your soul. I really think it does. And it impresses upon you. I in my book, Beyond the Trees, I use the word magic, that there's a certain magic in the wild. If we let ourselves feel it, it's there. And it's a feeling that's hard to put into words, but it speaks to something I think that's deep inside of all of us. For some of us, that thing might be dormant, it might be sleeping, but it's there. And when you go out into the real wilderness, the true wilderness, I mean, that's where you feel it's strongest, where it kindles back up inside of you. But I think that there's some sort of a residual holdover, even in our more urban lives, where people gravitate towards trees and nature and plants. I mean, there's something about, Mother Earth, if you want to think of it that way, that nurtures and sustains all of us, and it speaks to us on this deeper spiritual level. I mean, I've even seen studies that suggest that patients in hospitals who have access to nature or just a view of trees can recover faster than those that don't. And I mean, that to me is fascinating, and I could well believe it, that there's just something in there in nature that's good not only for our physical well-being, but our spiritual well-being, good for the soul. And I mean, on some level, that is an aspect that draws me back out onto these adventures and these journeys, time and time again, just to see nature and all its majesty, and the way that sort of seeps into your consciousness, the way that it's awe-inspiring, the way it touches your soul. So that to me is a big motivation, and it's something that I've tried very subtly to convey in my books, and particularly in the afterword. All 5 of my books have a special afterword in which I reflect on the value of wild places and why I think we need to do more to preserve wild places, not only for our own benefit, but for future generations. And in each of my books, I've tried to give a different reason for why I think preserving the natural world is important, usually aligning with the theme of that book.
Yeah, no, we're headed towards more campfire talk, Ben. We should have this. We should be move the studio outside. Adam could still zoom in, but that leads me to that. I hope you'll, in other books to come, that you'll talk more about this. The other thing too is that whole aspect of the energy out there that's in the great outdoors can be anywhere, and of course, you can sense energy from people. And I'm actually I'm working on a story right now about channeling and things, about a Backroads incident I had with and we've talked about this on the Backroads Build podcast, between the fighter jet pilot and the son, where they crashed and connected them 65 years later. But there's a whole energy with nature too, and I know, Ben, you were going to ask about conservation efforts, and that's a whole different topic. But yeah, there's so many things to talk about. And again, Adam, I do hope you'll talk more about in your books about not only the energy, but that whole aspect of lone and the connectivity. And again, the more I know, when I talk about it, when I'm with nature, and I use that with, that truly you're with nature, and we can talk about being part of a whole. But nonetheless, you were going to ask questions about the conservation efforts.
Well, I was just going to say, Adam, obviously you've been a big advocate for conservation of our land. You've been involved in so many different efforts. What to you has been probably the most impactful thing that you've been a part of so far?
Oh, well, I mean, there's a lot going on, and there are big environmental challenges. So I know many people who are environmentalists or conservationists, they can become depressed and dejected because it just oftentimes seems like we're not making any progress, and the weight of the world has them down, and the future is bleak. And I can relate to that kind of feeling. But one of the things that I'm a big advocate for, and which I think has kind of faded from from public consciousness over the last 2 decades, but was a lot bigger in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, is simply picking up litter. That to me is something that I think we should do more of, especially with students and young people in Canada. I mean, in Ontario, for example, we have to graduate from high school, you have to complete 40 hours of community service. And I always thought that there was an opportunity there to expand that in terms of actually cleaning up natural spaces, forests and wetlands, removing litter from those places. That's something I've done a lot of, Earth Day cleanups and other places, just going out and cleaning up a forest that has litter in it. And I think that there's something about that that immediately gives you a sort of feeling of positivity and a certain high, because what's nice about those kind of activities is you see the immediate payoff. You go into an area and it's like, oh man, look at this litter. But just a small group of people acting together, as they say, can change the world, and you can have an immediate impact where you say, we clean that creek up. I used to do that when I was in my early 20s, organize cleanups of local creeks where we'd go down them in canoes and we would haul out all kinds of stuff. I remember once we even pulled out a shopping cart out of this creek, and bottles and golf balls, all kinds of junk. We would remove it. And I do that same sort of thing in the forest. And it always makes me feel so much better at the end of the day, where it's like, yeah, we finally wiped out that big area of broken bottles where there's glass, where an animal could step on that, get it embedded in their paw, and we've restored it. So, that sort of simple thing. And I know it was a big focus starting in the 1970s, where up until that point, the culture in North America had been really bad in terms of just, littering everywhere. And there were steps taken to try to keep things beautiful, adopt roads and programs like that. And it spread from there through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. And it was a big thing. And I remember when I was a kid in the 90s, we used to do that at my elementary school. We'd clean up the woods around the school. But it seems like in the last couple of decades, it's sort of faded out of public consciousness a little bit. And it's not really a thing that people do as much anymore. And I don't think I'm alone in saying that, yeah, I've noticed a lot more litter on the trails in the last 5-10 years or so. I think a lot of people have commented on that fact, especially with COVID bringing more people into the outdoors, which on the one hand is a good thing. But on the other hand, I remember I was appalled, like, why is there Tim Hortons coffee cups everywhere here, like at this beautiful waterfall? I'm like, do people really still do this in the year 2024? Like, there's an actual designated recycling bin over there. Surely we've got to do a better job on this sort of thing. But I think that is actually a potential positive, in the sense that many of the environmental problems the world faces, they can actually mentally defeat people before we've even taken any steps, because they just start to think, this is so daunting. There's 8 billion people in the world. What could I possibly do? It doesn't make any difference. There's nothing I can do to change anything. But when you start local and you start small with something like that, you can see an immediate payoff. And psychologically, it gives you a boost, because you think, this little patch of forest, in one afternoon, we made it better. And that can be sort of a stepping stone to bigger projects and, planting trees, doing some work on invasive species to save some of our trees that we're currently losing, and banding together to, restore wetlands or forest habitats on a larger scale. So it's got to start somewhere. And I think that's, especially for young people, students and kids, that's a really good way to start.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. We used to have things called the trash bash, and we'd clean up the Mattawa River and along the highway. And of course, I've got a Tim Hortons cup here. Where is it? There it is. Unfortunately, I should have my mug. And I used to try to measure. At one time that we only had one Tim Hortons in North Bay, and the ski hill was in Mattawa. So when we did the highway, we'd see where maybe how long that coffee lasted before someone threw it out the indiscriminately out the window. But here's something you'll be pleased with. On Tuesday, on the next Backroads Bill podcast, we're going to have Dana Starkel, the son of Dawn, and the producer of the documentary, Chris Ford, on the Backroads Bill podcast. And of course, their epic 17,000 kilometer trip from, Manitoba down the Mississippi, along Central America into the Amazon. So I was thinking, again, you mentioned earlier in the podcast, you're going to go with Wes for a new trek, a new adventure. So you could talk about that. And then I thought to myself, we don't want to take Indiana Jones out of our own Canadian backyard, but of course the world is a big place. And when you think about epic rivers and other things, because you've gone north-south, you've gone east-west at different latitudes and longitudes. And so maybe talk about your next adventure. And again, I guess you probably did read the early book, but that was back in the 1980s, 1980 to 82. And in fact, I'm just completing that story. And again, they're going to be on the podcast, but because we're kind of really interested to hear, that's 44 years ago as well. So a little bit about the future for you.
Yeah, I mean, I know Don Starkell's books. I have Paddle to the Arctic as well on my bookshelf, as Paddle to the Amazon. And yeah, I've always been fascinated by those journeys. I mean, for me, Canada is such a vast place. So even if I spend the rest of my life just within Canada, I could hardly complain, because I always remind myself, even if I lived 10 lifetimes, I'd never even come close to seeing everything that Canada has to offer. I'd barely scratch the surface. It's just so vast. No one could hope to see it all in their lifetime, right? In Ontario alone, there's hundreds of thousands of lakes. And in Canada as a whole, there's 3 million plus thousands of mountains and caves and rivers. I mean, it's just, the scale is incredible. I dream up far more expeditions than I'll ever be able to possibly undertake. But at the same time, never say never. And inspiration comes from the unlikeliest of places. So I can't say no to doing a journey beyond Canada's boundaries. Anything is possible. I don't know what's in the cards. The future is unwritten. We'll have to wait and see. It was a falcon, of all things, that inspired me to do my last journey. So anything could happen. This year, I have a lot of expeditions planned. One of them, which has a sort of conservation theme involving students and young people in Canada, is involving reptiles, specifically snakes. I thought, it's interesting that in Canada, when we think of our iconic wildlife, it's all the familiar animals like polar bears and beavers and moose and loons. And those things are all great. I'm fans of them. And I'm like, isn't it funny that we never really think of Canada's reptiles? They don't get much attention at all. I don't think I've ever seen them on the cover of Canadian Geographic. When most people think of snakes in Canada, we only usually think of just a handful of very common species like garter snakes, maybe northern water snakes, but not a whole lot beyond that. And then I've been into snakes ever since I was a teenager. I had a job with the Ministry of Natural Resources as a 17-year-old, in which I got to work on Eastern Massasauga rattlesnake studies with biologists. And I thought, man, this is cool. What's the biggest snake in Canada? And I remember looking that up and being like, wow, we have these giant black rat snakes that get up to 8 feet long. That's massive. And they live in trees. And yet you never hear about them. And then I read about blue racers and hognose snakes. And I was like, well, this is astonishing. We have over 30 different species of snakes in Canada alone, and yet the vast majority of Canadians have never heard of the vast majority of these species. So I thought, well, I like birds, and I just did a big adventure based around birds, where the falcon flies. And I thought, just like how birders kind of have a big year where they go out and try to spot in the wild as many different bird species as they can, I thought, well, what if I did something similar, but not with birds, with snakes? What if I tried to find in the wild, in their natural habitat, all of Canada's native species of snake, all 30 of them, and photograph them in the wild. So this started what I called the Great Canadian Snake Quest. And there's a website, there's links to it on my website, but it's snakequest.ca, in which I'm trying to find all of Canada's native species of snakes. And specifically, I'm doing this sort of for classrooms to get students inspired to want to learn more about Canada's reptiles, what threatens them, why some species are endangered, what we can do to potentially help them. And on the website, there's descriptions of each different species. There's a story of how I track them or try to find them, and range maps. Where do they live in Canada? What kind of habitat do they like? And my photographs of these snakes. So I actually started the project last year just as a passion project of mine in between doing Arctic expeditions for fun. And I found about a dozen different species of snake last summer, almost all the Ontario ones. So this spring, I'm going to expand that and go to Western Canada, try to find all the Western Canadian species. My friend Wes is even bigger into snakes than I am. He always has been. He's always liked snakes a lot. And he came with me when I first started the Snake Quest. We found a blue racer, which is one of the rarest snakes. There's only a few hundred left in the wild. Beautiful snake, almost 5 feet long, vivid blue color. We found one of those, and I said, look, you got to come with me out west. You're my good luck charm. So let's go find all these Western snakes in Saskatchewan and Alberta and BC. And that's going to be my spring project. And then later on, I'm heading on a big northern canoe journey again this summer into the fall, into September. This is quite different. It's more of a history project, archaeology project about a lost explorer, someone who vanished back in 1910. And I have been very slowly over the years retracing his roots and going into different archives, tracking down old diaries and letters and maps, trying to piece together the mystery of his disappearance. And I want to write a biography, a book on him, and tell his story, bring it to light because he's not well known at all, and possibly make a documentary about him as well. So that's my other project for the rest of this coming summer.
Again, it's been a real pleasure. Now, a couple of things we're going to mention. We're going to go to, for listeners, go to adamshoalts.com, Adam Shoalts, all one word, .com, and that's SHOALTS. And then, of course, that's one thing. And, of course, Adam is going to be back at Samuel de Champlain Provincial Park, where the Canadian Ecology Centre is located. First weekend of October was the October 4th and 5th. 5th and 6th. So that'll be on his website to track down. And Ben, over to you.
Yeah, I just want to thank you so much for coming on and taking some time out of your day to talk to us. It's been an absolute pleasure to get to listen to both of you guys speak about stuff you're so passionate about. And I grew up having a cottage and kind of being in the outdoors. My parents were both teachers, so we spent all summer out there. So I understand that connection between the two, and then obviously life kind of takes you in a different path. I probably should have spent more time outside, realistically, but it's always great to hear people who go on these adventures and really kind of take life by the horns and really live it. So thank you.
Well, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on the podcast. I'm looking forward to coming back to the Canadian Ecology Centre in October.
A huge thank you to Adam for spending the time with Bill and myself. It was really amazing getting to listen to both Bill and Adam talk about their passion for the outdoors and some of the crazy stories that came up. And as Bill actually mentioned in this episode, next week, we're going to have Chris Ford and Dana Starkell on the show. Chris shot a documentary that took over 20 years to make about Dana and his father, Don, and how they paddled in a canoe from Canada all the way to South America and back. We're talking about canoeing over 12,000 miles in total. So keep an eye on that for next Wednesday. And as always, you can find more episodes of the Backroads Bill podcast on all of your favorite podcast players and over on NorthBayEcho.ca every single Wednesday morning. And while you're there on the North Bay Echo website, you can also check out all of the other great local North Bay podcasts we offer and sign up for our newsletter, Echo Essentials, to keep up to date with all the local happenings in North Bay. Also, if you enjoyed today's episode, you can help us out by leaving a rating or review on whatever platform you are on. That is greatly appreciated and will help us continue to improve this show. So we will see you all next Wednesday for the next Backroads Bill adventure.